I remember in undergraduate school when I was studying biology that was when the Human Genome Project was completed. And that was supposed to be this like triumphant time in terms of helping people to either prevent disease or heal from disease. Because now we knew what the genes were that people had. And now if someone had a faulty gene, let's say they inherited a faulty gene that predisposed them for a disease, we could fix them and we could give them gene targeted treatments and therapies. Fast forward 20 years later, and that has not panned out. The concept that we've inherited bad genes and those bad genes drive disease really is not at all true, in my opinion. And in fact, it's quite disempowering to think that we are the results of the genes that we've gotten and have that essentially takes our power away. It gives us this idea that we have very little control over the fact that we may develop diabetes or cancer or cardiovascular disease. And so, to talk about this from a more empowering perspective, I want to talk about the concept called epigenetics. Epigenetics means, epi means basically things that are above the level of the genome or things that go above the level of your DNA that influence how your body functions, including your DNA, what proteins you express, what types of programs your body is running at any given time. So the assumption, and I think that you've inherited this particular gene, and this particular gene is going to give you cancer at this percentage likelihood. To me, that is just, it's just not true. And so what are things that I've seen in clinical observation? Well, I've actually seen people map out their genes quite a bit, right? You can get these things called genetic SNP tests to see if you've got different variants. And it's been very disheartening to see people who have gone through extensive analysis of their genes and then been told they had certain SNPs which would predispose them to, say, detoxification issues or cardiovascular events, and then given a boatload of supplements to help support their bad genes, their faulty genes, and for them not to see any improvement whatsoever, especially when these individuals weren't counseled in this topic of epigenetics. And so I want you to understand that I'm going to talk about this now through the lens of cancer. Again, this is another one. It's like, well, cancer's on the rise. Back in the day, the likelihood of getting cancer was way less. And now, there are some people out there who will say, well, the likelihood is increasing, Carrie, because the population is increasing. Certainly. The likelihood is increasing, Carrie, because the population is getting older. Certainly. But what's very troubling for me is the fact that younger and younger people are developing cancer at astonishingly alarming rates. And so this has nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with the environment and how the environment is either promoting health or driving people into a state of disease. And so the concept of epigenetics needs to be at the forefront of any conversation when it comes to therapeutic strategies to support people, especially with cancer. Now, I talk extensively about light and cancer. There is some amazing research on mitochondrial dysfunction in cancer. And so what I want people to be aware of is you may have quote unquote genes that promote cancer in your body, but it doesn't mean that those genes are going to automatically turn on and start to develop cancer in your tissues. So let's talk a little bit about what influences the genes. Well, in terms of the epi, I always talk about the environment and our environment. And there's a couple of ways that we can look at that, and I'll break it down. But our environment is essentially communicating to our mitochondria. And our mitochondria are deciding at any given moment how much water and ATP they should produce to support our tissues, our organs, basically bring our body into homeostasis. The other thing that those mitochondria are doing is as they're making water and ATP, they're releasing light. This light is called biophotons. And these biophotons are like a light show signal that will influence what's called gene expression or DNA expression. And so just because we have a gene doesn't mean it's going to be expressed or going to turn into something harmful to us. As long as we have adequate energy and healthy mitochondria in our tissues, and we've got healthy light signaling to our genes, the body will return to health and homeostasis. And so that is why I really want to emphasize to people, it has way less to do with the genes that you have in your body and way more to do with how are you communicating from your environment to your mitochondria to those genes? And in fact, and this video is not going to be long enough for me to go into this, but there is interesting evidence to indicate that the genes that you're born with are not actually just static and unchanging. And also this concept that really blew my mind in undergrad was the fact that they found that, approximately 90 to 98% of the genes that we had were called junk DNA. Supposedly they didn't serve a purpose. And in future videos, I'd like to lay out more and more why that concept is the human body is way too intelligently created to have just 98% of it be junk DNA. And so we've really been working from a very compromised perspective when it comes to supporting people, especially people who are dealing with maybe cancer prevention or a cancer diagnosis, who are going through cancer treatment. And so what I want to talk about here are a couple of the broad categories of what epi would be influencing my mitochondria. Number one, I say, is light, right? We know that light at the correct time and darkness at the correct time makes for optimum mitochondrial function. And in fact, remember that appropriate darkness signaling through melatonin production from the pineal gland is what runs the programs of autophagy and apoptosis in my cells. That apoptosis is designed to kill cancerous cells. So we've got a built-in anti-cancer program if we can run it, because we're experiencing true darkness at the correct time based on our circadian and circannual experiences. The other things that would influence my mitochondria that are epigenetic would be toxin exposure. And this toxin exposure can come from things like the food supply. It can come from the water supply. It can come from our personal care products. It can come from various forms of medications and pharmaceuticals. And these toxins can absolutely harm the mitochondria's ability to appropriately make energy and ATP, or water and ATP. When mitochondria become compromised, let's say when there's a toxin that prevents the mitochondria from efficiently flowing electrons to make that water and that ATP, what happens? Well, the mitochondria start to make more biophotons. They leak light, if you will. And that light that leaks can actually create additional damage inside of the cell. But also remember, we want some light signaling going on to the DNA, for example, to indicate what genes to express or not express. But when we have very aggressive light going on, that's a warning signal. That's a danger response. And in that danger response, the cellular communication can kind of get, chaotic, if you will. And that can ultimately result in faulty gene expression. Other things as well is when the mitochondria don't have adequate water, especially exclusion zone water, that can also lead to a signal for the cells to grow uncontrollably. And I'm not going to go too much in depth in the mechanisms here, but what I want you to realize is we are not at the mercy of the genes we've been given. And we have so much control over the environment that surrounds our bodies and surrounds our genes to be able to influence healthy mitochondrial function and therefore healthy gene expression. Another thing to be aware of here is not just what's coming from outside, but our own thoughts and intentions have actually been shown to influence our DNA. A researcher who I met at the water conference named Glenn Ryan has done some very extensive research on this, where he showed that focused human intention was able to influence DNA by either creating more gene expression, which would be unwinding the DNA, or actually creating more DNA silencing, which would be closing the DNA. And so we have, through our own thoughts and intentions, the ability to influence our very own DNA expression as well. And so I hope from this lens, this is the starting point of a conversation that we can have about how we can be empowered through the lens of epigenetics, through the lens of mitochondrial support, through the lens of water, through the lens of energy and intention, and to have tools in our toolbox that we can use either for disease prevention, or if we are in the throes of a current condition or disease, maybe we can find some additional support to help your body return to the thriving, healing state that it's designed to return to.